Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, people of all fandoms, welcome to the Ferret Raccoon podcast, episode 143. I am your one and only host for this podcast, the Angry Raccoon, bringing you the second podcast of June 2020. And this is going to be quite an interesting podcast. I'm going to say that right up front. We have some very interesting things that definitely do regard 2020 and the future of, I guess, society and civilization. So you could chop this down to being a quite impactful and important podcast. But before we kind of get into the few things I want to talk about, the first thing I do want to talk about is the one and only film I watched over the last 2 weeks, which was the 2015 film Tangerine. Now, this film is most notably known for the fact that it was filmed on an iPhone, being an iPhone 5. And it is a very interesting film in that it essentially takes place over the course of one day following two transgendered prostitutes, essentially dealing with a situation I do not want to spoil right off the bat, but we do almost follow these characters almost like a fly on the wall, almost in a sense that this is just some guy who just so happens to have stumbled upon a really interesting series of events that unfolds. And despite the very, I would say, possibly bad audio mixing and music choice and some of the mixing, it was a really interesting and fascinating film that essentially dived into a slightly more gritty and somewhat dirty and sleazy underworld that kind of plagues America / Hollywood, California. It was a very interesting deep dive into these kinds of things. And I think if you're definitely someone who enjoys films that are more kind of like character studies and more about like the moment right there as it's happening, I would highly recommend this film. And I think it was definitely a very appropriate film for audiences and people to see during LGBT awareness / Pride Month, if I believe it is Pride Month. But it is very introspective, and I would highly recommend it if you can get a copy of it. It is the same director who went on to direct and make the Florida Project, another really good film that definitely dives into and talks about this kind of underlining subculture of people that are just below the poverty line to some extent, or these kinds of subcultural people. But that was the one thing I wanted to mention. I haven't really been doing anything else much over the last 2 weeks, mainly because I've been working on things have been changing, and I want to make sure that I am prepared as much as possible for the upcoming events that will most likely proceed in the future. And I want to quickly address my voice. I have a slight cold. The weather has been a bit all over the place. It's been both very sunny and hot, and then immediately it will just turn to rain, and like an idiot I have not been putting on an extra layer of clothing. So I apologize if I do not sound great or I sound a bit down or depressed. I can assure you right now I am somewhat, happy right now, but not in regards to the current state of the world, which is still being gripped by COVID-19 as well as other very silly things. But the one thing I wanted to quickly mention as we're kind of going into things we are talking about is I do want to talk about the protests and riots regarding the senseless killing of George Floyd that happened over in America, and the protests and demonstrations regarding the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a very unfortunate situation, and I could honestly sit here for an hour to 2 hours addressing certain things in certain aspects, but I would imagine that has been well documented and well talked about over the last 2 weeks. My 2 cents, as much as it would be valuable, isn't really going to add too much to the situation, because as I've already stated, we all know that what happened regarding George Floyd was absolutely disgusting, and there needs to be change. This protest is not necessarily about showing some kind of aggression, and it's not necessarily about just one man being betrayed by the justice system. It is about the world, it is about our culture, it is about the fact that change needs to happen. And in my personal opinion, for anyone who doesn't understand why these protests are happening, why they are still happening, and why people are angry, you honestly are an idiot, in my opinion. It should be very plain to see what is going on. But in regards to all those things, as well as I should mention that over in England, protests have happened in regards to statues of figureheads that have connections to do with prejudice, racism, slavery, have been attacked, assaulted, and taken down in some slightly more comedic senses. I cannot remember the name of this unknown person who was apparently a slave owner or slave trader. His statue was taken down and dropped into the river, which has kind of created a bit of a pandemic over in England/London, where statues have been under constant attack, constant protection, which I find very interesting. I know someone vandalized the Winston Churchill statues, etching racist on it, to which there was a very interesting and very tone-deaf series of images where they essentially had a black man remove the etching of the word racist, and then you had a bunch of or three white people basically standing right outside the statue as if they're the ones who removed said statement made. Very tone deaf. It just goes to show we still have a lot of change and a lot of progress to make, because that does not look good. But one thing I do want to mention, which I do consider a must watch, a very valuable watch, is going to be 8 minutes and 46 seconds by Dave Chappelle. This is not a comedy session. This is Dave Chappelle essentially being very real and talking about this current station regarding George Floyd, regarding the riots, regarding certain aspects and certain subjects he's talked about in regards to the relationship between black and white, the police and people within America, police brutality. He brings up a lot of very good points, a lot of connections between him, racism, slavery, and all other manner of things that may not necessarily are the nicest thing to hear, but I think it is a valuable thing to hear. Dave Chappelle isn't really making jokes here. This is not a comedy sketch. The only real sense of jokes he's making is at the expense of some truly awful people. So please go into this video with that in mind. It's about 28 minutes long, and I would highly recommend everyone watch this, because I'm not trying to say that this is the, Dave Chappelle says it best, or he has the best opinion, or his opinion is my opinion. I do agree with a lot of the things that Dave Chappelle was saying, and I think the majority of people do agree with what he's saying, because he is speaking absolute common sense here, in my opinion. But please go into this with a focused sense of mind. Do not go into this, thinking this is going to be comedy, thinking this is all fun and games. This is very serious. Dave Chappelle is very raw here. He is very real. He is very emotional. And honestly, if you do not understand, once again, why this whole situation is going on, just don't bother watching the video, because clearly ignorant people don't want to be educated and they don't want to accept anyone else's opinions on the matter. But as much as I don't want to spoil this video, because I think everyone should go and watch. If you're going to watch one thing from this podcast, it's definitely this, was some of the very choice words and connections Dave Chappelle made. For example, when talking about how certain people within the media have essentially been asking and complaining why George Floyd is a hero, saying he shouldn't be regarded as a hero because he had a criminal past, or he was being arrested because he did this or did that. Dave Chappelle puts it very bluntly and basically says he does not give a shit what he did, given that what they did to him was wrong. And so he doesn't really understand why a lot of people, especially in the police force of different races, they don't understand why black people and other people are essentially rioting, because it's essentially, as he puts it, they killed themselves. They killed one of us. Because if someone went and attacked your family, you're going to do something against them, aren't you? It just goes without saying. And he did put it very perfectly, where he essentially said, and I quote, "We're not desperate for heroes in the black community. Any nigger that survives this nightmare is my goddamn hero," which I feel kind of sums up the whole situation and the constant situations very perfectly. And I do like how he does kind of loop things back, once again, not to spoil things, talking about how a lot of people have been almost complaining and asking, why are the celebrities not talking about this? Why is Dave Chappelle not talking about this? To which Dave Chappelle puts it very bluntly by saying that by basically saying that he sees what is going on and that the streets can talk for themselves. They don't need celebrities to be saying anything right now, which I thought was a very poignant point. Excuse me. But absolutely watch this video. It is in the link in the download description. It's in the description and download link. I can't even speak. But I would highly recommend everyone make the time and watch this, because it is, like I said, very, very valuable, no matter what side of the spectrum you are. But let's move on to news stories. And the main things I'm going to be talking about on this podcast do regard to the future, and mainly the future of video gaming, as this week, or at least last week when this podcast is going up, was meant to be the week of E3, which is essentially the biggest marketing event slash video game showcase for the future. And we've had two things essentially take the spot and replace that, being IGN's Summer of Gaming. And they've gone on for just about a week or so, I believe, starting on Tuesday, I think it was, or Sunday. I can't remember. I've honestly not really been watching said live streams they've been doing. But I will give them a bit of props. I do appreciate the fact that they are highlighting smaller and more independent games that otherwise would have been displayed within a few seconds of a compilation video that would have been shown on a big screen during Microsoft's presentation. So it's nice to actually hear from these developers talk about the games that they are so passionate about. The only downside between these IGN live streams is the very obvious, like, bad audio quality coming from Skype or whatever they're using, and just like the audio delay. But it is very interesting to hear interviews from these people who otherwise never would have had the time of day to, have a platform to talk about their games. So I will give them the props. But for the most part, they are showing a lot of games, and given that this is a slightly more game-centric episode, I do not want to just be talking about video games, because I understand that not everyone is into video games. So I'm going to be somewhat quick with this section, because this podcast doesn't need to go on forever. So the two main games which I really liked, which I want to talk about from Summer of Gaming that have been shown off so far, just these two. The first being Alex Kidd in Miracle World DX, which was a interesting surprise to see Sega's original poster boy return for a remake game. For those of you who don't know, Alex Kidd was essentially Sega's first mascot who just wasn't working. He wasn't really kind of capturing, audiences. He wasn't really on the same level as Mario. And then obviously they made Sonic, and then history was made. So it's nice to kind of see this character kind of come back to the forefront in a smaller arcade, independent-ish game, which is pretty interesting. It's very cool that it has clearly been taking inspiration from arcade, modern games, and independent games of the modern era, that have like an 8-bit, 16-bit style aesthetic, and they're kind of taking this as a basis for how these games kind of look, with this game's more updated graphics, as well as being faithful to the original, as well as other games which have kind of set the precedent for the standard of RPG, nostalgic, retro-looking games of the new era. So I'm honestly really looking forward to this game, and I hope that it is faithful, but adds a few new twists and turns to the original game, because I like Alex Kidd as a character, and it's just a shame that he's kind of disappeared over the last decade or so, other than just being in references. The other trailer I want to talk about is the trailer for Demon Turf, which is essentially this very interesting kind of awesome combination between Paper Mario, Had in Time, and the Disgaea series, as it essentially seems like you'll be playing as this demon girl in the underworld, and you essentially have to take over areas and bosses, but the whole game is presented in both 3D and 2D planes, in that the main character is essentially a 16-bit character who is essentially 2D flat, while the rest of the world is more 3D polygon based slash N64 era type styled, and it honestly looks and flows pretty well for the most part. Some of the camera movements and character movements aren't the greatest right now, but obviously this is a game in development. It doesn't come out until like next year, so I'm not gonna really hope that against them right now. But it looks interesting, and it looks like a really charming and fun game. I would highly recommend look at both of these games. Link to both those games in the download link and the description, so check them out if you're interested. And the next section of, I guess, video games I want to talk about is essentially the PlayStation 5 reveal event thing that happened. I actually watched the whole live stream, and I will give Sony some props. They did a pretty good job with the presentation. They were very smart and very clever in that they did the opposite of Microsoft, where Microsoft essentially showed roughly the same game over and over and over again, which was cyberpunk shooter game. Sony essentially went for, let's show variation, and there was a nice kind of, how shall I put it? They gave a lot of attention to games that were more diverse, games that would appeal to different age groups, and they definitely specified more with platformers and such. So, for example, we saw a lot of games like, one I'm about to talk about, as well as, Sackboy and his platform adventure. They showed off that one that looked like, not to be nasty, it looked like fan art, in that it had like a slightly more cartoony art style with the characters, a little bit more anthropomorphic, cartoony like. Stuff like that. Stuff that obviously maybe doesn't appeal to me, but is obviously going to appeal to a certain kind of audience, which is nice. Sony were very smart in, once again, showing variation, showing that PS4 is a system for people who want experiences, people who want variation, people who want the old, people who want the new, people who want different kinds of things. And I guess I should talk about the PlayStation 5's design real quick, but let me just hold on a sec. Sorry, I have to make sure my computer doesn't go to sleep. It's a bit finicky, and I'm terrified the audio is going to cut off if it goes to sleep, so sorry about that. But the design of the PS5 itself, I know a lot of people have spent the last few days comparing it to a internet router or modem, which is understandable. Obviously, everyone on Twitter just wants to be the funny guy, and it's obviously very boring. But I like the design, honestly. I do not like the color scheme. I prefer systems and consoles to be of one color, and I'm sure there will be variations, one that's all black, one that's all white, and all that. But as of now, I'm not really feeling the black, white, blue kind of look. I do kind of like that it's very intentionally trying to look as futuristic as possible. Like, it definitely wants to be, this is the future. And in terms of actual design flair, it has edge over the Xbox Series X, which just looks like a box. And I do like the fact that it has exhaustion fans or holes for air to come out. I don't know what that's called exactly, but that just goes to show that it must be pretty powerful if it needs to be constantly dispelling air. So I honestly like the design. It's not bad, honestly. I mean, it's definitely a departure from what Sony consoles have looked like, but hey, this is the future. First game I want to talk about, which was, in my opinion, the most impressive and best game that they showcased, was Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, which was really interesting because I honestly thought that after the remake of the first Ratchet & Clank game on PS4, and the fact that Sony acquired the studio back in 2019, I thought Insomniac were pretty much just going to be making Spider-Man games until they're inevitably closed down by Sony. And it's awesome that one of Sony's most iconic characters is essentially back. I hope that this means that Sly Cooper will come back, soon as Sony now owns the rights to the Sly Cooper franchise. But I was really happy to see Ratchet & Clank return and essentially be in the forefront of Sony's presentation. And that's another thing I'll mention about the presentation. They really allowed for a lot of games that otherwise wouldn't really have any spotlight to really shine for a few minutes. I thought that was great. I don't really care for like graphical power or like processing power. I'm into the games, and mainly just the games. If the game's good, that's all I really care about. But in this trailer, when you see Ratchet & Clank jumping through these rifts that are opening up and they're teleporting him to different worlds, if these worlds were loading in that fast a time or not loading at all, because one thing that was kind of specified that Sony is really kind of pushing and promoting is that no loading time, seamless, world creation or generation. If that's real, and this is all like seamlessly and smooth, how you can just basically travel from world to world, or you'll be thrown into a world just like that, and that's really impressive. Like, that's honestly a real showcase and performance, because I have not seen anything from Microsoft as of now that is visually or performance-wise impressive. It's just been more games. And like I said, it's all about the games, but That's pretty incredible because this is essentially a concept realized. One of my biggest problems with the PS4 is the awful loading times. Not just for games loading, but just starting up games, closing games, the interface. It just loads awfully, and I really can't stand it. But that's pretty cool. I mean, in terms of the game, it's the same tried and true gameplay from the series with some more realized concepts, like, for example, kind of, hoisting yourself forward with rifts and that kind of stuff. And it is very interesting in terms of what they're going to do with the story, given that, as the title implied, rift apart, maybe our main characters, Ratchet and Clank, are going to be in separate worlds or separate dimensions, and even that kind of tease at the end when you see that other character, the other Lombax character, just appear out of nowhere. That's quite interesting. I don't think that's the future where Clank the robot appears. I think that's an alternate future. But we'll see. Very interested in this game. Very interested. I've played roughly almost all the Ratchet and Clank games, and I will most likely play this game at some point. I got to play the remake at some point as well, which I'm going to buy. The next trailer I want to talk about, which was one that I have known about for a while, but I'm glad it finally got revealed and showcased, was Resident Evil 8 Village. I'm a big Resident Evil fan. I loved Resident Evil 7, and I'm so glad to see that finally more Resident Evil in a new sense, no more remakes for the time being. And this game, from what the trailer was showcasing, it's taking the series in familiar yet different directions, and I'm liking what they're presenting here, especially the gothic, paranormal, winter open world vibes of this village and castle. It's very interesting. It does remind me a lot of Resident Evil 4, but a lot more realized, and it honestly does make me wonder if these games are going to be somewhat connected in terms of the Resident Evil 4 remake, which is coming out in 2020, as that also takes place in a foreign European country, mainly in a village, castle, island setting. So it should be very interesting to see what happens there. But the trailer throws a lot at you, which was quite interesting because they kind of established the story and the characters and the threats and the general theming and the vibe of everything. And I really kind of hope that the game doesn't turn out being messy or too busy with all these characters, because there's a lot of characters we see. I mean, we see who the main character is. There's also meant to be a female playable character who may or may not be in the trailer. We've seen possibly maybe 5 antagonists in this game, if they are actually antagonists, which is pretty crazy. So I just hope that not too much is going on with this game. And I also think that making Chris and I'm going to use the quotation marks, bad guy, is a great starting point for the story, as it opens up so much more mystery as to what the hell is going on. Because, as most Resident Evil fans will know, Chris Redfield is the good guy. He is one of the goodest guys out there. And to see him essentially do the things he does in the trailer, which I won't spoil just in case you haven't seen the trailer yet, is very interesting. And there is a very interesting emphasis on him being like this oppressive presence. Even one of the key visuals, which people have been making fun of, but I still think is pretty cool, it kind of shows Chris kind of looming over a village, but he's also part of the mountain, which is kind of an interesting visual. It makes me wonder what exactly they're going to do with this character, what they're going to do with the playable character Ethan Winters. It is very interesting, but I'm very excited. I honestly cannot wait to see more. I believe Capcom said they're going to be showing off a lot more in the coming months, because as of right now, there's literally only a few seconds of gameplay, which you can look up. But I'm not going to include it in the download link in the description, simply because it's just the developers talking and teasing things, and you literally only see like 15 seconds of the main character moving in a mansion. So you can't really gauge a whole game on that. And the last video game trailer I want to talk about is for Pragmata, which is another Capcom game, and it's so strange yet original. I have no idea what the hell this game is going to play as, but I'm honestly really interested and invested. It's also great to have Capcom doing something new. I was starting to get a bit worried that they would only be focusing on Resident Evil remakes and sequels. So it's nice to see them with an original, hopefully great idea. It's just so visually interesting. Just some astronaut walking in New York City. There's like this, young girl there, and then there's like a hologram of a cat, and this girl seems to have some kind of power that connects to the astronaut technology, and they're flying through space and they're on the moon. It's amazing. It's so interesting. It is hopefully going to be an incredible game. And I know there were many other games shown off at the Sony reveal event, and I will put a hopefully live stream or video of the whole event if you want to go and watch the whole hour and 30 minutes. But that's not to say that I didn't like anything else. There are a lot of games in there that I thought looked pretty cool. Some I didn't care for, but overall I give them a thumbs up in terms of what they presented. And let's move on to the last thing I want to talk about, which is something that has been highly anticipated for a while. Although I'm not the biggest fan of the series, I'm pretty interested in what they're going to do with this, and that is going to be Bill and Ted Face the Music, Bill and Ted's Adventures 3. This has been long in the works, long talked about, and before I kind of talk about my thoughts, I'm gonna say this one thing that I've said plenty of times before. I would much rather have a bad sequel than a pointless remake. And that is not to say that I think this looks bad. I honestly think this looks extremely promising for a sequel taking place decades after the last film. It's very interesting. It's so interesting that already it's such a strange and interesting film, because we have Keanu Reeves and Alex Winters, and they still have their teenager voices, the whoa dude, that kind of stuff. And they are basically acting like teenagers, or they still are their teenager counterparts, like they haven't grown up, yet they're clearly grown men. They look nothing like how they looked in the original films. And that's a really funny contrast that works, because they could have easily had, Keanu and Alex basically do their normal voices and just be like, oh, we're Bill and Ted, but we've grown up now. But that's a very interesting direction to have them almost as if they haven't been able to let go of the past, but at the same time, they're still true to themselves and their lifestyle, which I think is a really great concept for a nostalgic sequel. It also feels as if it's going to be a fateful blast from the past at the same time. That was the vibes I got. It also feels like it's going to be like a continuation, yet commentary on the last two films. For the fact it seems like nothing has changed when a lot has changed in the grand scheme of things. They both have children, and with children undoubtedly comes change and growth, and yet there doesn't seem to be any of that really with the main characters. They seem to reference the fact that they haven't made the song to bring world peace, and the fact that they've kind of almost become washed up to some extent, implying that they had a sort of fame. I honestly feel like this film could win a lot of respect and a lot of points if it does address nostalgia and wasted potential. But I do feel like this film isn't taking itself like super seriously and has like this perfect balance of almost kind of winking to the audience, which I hope does work in the film's strengths. It wasn't the greatest trailer I've ever seen, but it definitely felt like it was something original yet new but old at the same time. I think that the main word is faithful when I see this trailer. When I think about this film, it's faithful. Whether or not the film comes out as being as good as the originals or even good at all, only time will tell. But already it definitely seemed, once again, just coming back to those two buzzwords, promising and faithful. And hopefully it does live up to that. And hopefully, if it is good, it does get as much attention as possible. But there are some very interesting concepts in this trailer, like the fact that they're going to go to the future to essentially, take the song they should have written from themselves, and, we have them in prison as like the biggest, toughest guys. And obviously the relationship between their children, I believe they both have daughters, if I remember correctly. That should be interesting. I think you briefly see them for a second. It looked like they were maybe kind of embarrassed by them. So I'm honestly wondering if it's going to be the case of, are they just a typical, oh, I'm always on my phone, oh, my dad is awkward kind of thing? Or if it's going to be a slightly more, oh, my dad's a bit awkward, but I still love him because he's my dad kind of thing. That should be interesting to see what they do with them. And, they might even start a spin-off with the two daughters. I don't know. But very interesting stuff. And I definitely wanted to mention this because I know a lot of people have been looking forward to the return of Bill and Ted. It's also lovely to see that both Alex Winters and Keanu Reeves back again, because we haven't seen much of Alex Winters, and I think he's a very underrated, performer, person in general. So regardless, this should hopefully be a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling for a lot of people. And if that is the case, I'm happy for people. But no discussion in this podcast, because this podcast has gone on for long enough. But we do have the video of the episode, which is an interesting one, and that is going to be Night Runner Magnum Bullets. This is by Knights of the Light Table, who are essentially a independent-ish animation studio that essentially gather artists and animators from around the world in order to make projects. This particular music video was directed by Patrick Starnd. Sorry if I got your name incorrect. And I will be honest, I hate the song in this music video. It is a song done by someone from Game Grumps, and I am sorry, he cannot sing. His voice sounds awful. The music sounds bland and forgettable. If you have the same sentiment that I have towards the actual music of this music video, I would highly recommend mute the audio and listen to Resonance by Home. That song, I've tested, fits the visuals way better, because the visuals are fantastic. It has this nice kind of futuristic, nostalgic 80s aesthetic kind of animated vibe, kind of has a little bit of cyberpunk influence, a little bit of anthropomorphic characters in there. Really nice, well done animation. I am putting this as the video of the episode purely on visuals alone. Once again, the song, in my opinion, sucks. I think it's awful. If you feel the same way, Home, Resonance. Listen to that song instead of the actual music, because it's goddamn awful. Not Home, but the song that the person's singing. Home, Resonance, visuals, fantastic. And I'm going to leave you on that note. Now, that brings us to the end of the podcast, and also next podcast, which should be interesting, because as the next podcast is going up just before the end of June, June marks the halfway point of 2020. And as of tradition with the Ferret Raccoon podcast, we usually do the best and the worst of the year so far. And I'm not going to make any promises. I'm just going to say this is what we're going to try and do. But I'm going to try and get some people on the podcast via online. I'm not having anyone come around any building, because it is not safe and it's not wise, and I'm sure all of you would disagree if I were to bring back anyone from the podcast, and risk our lives just for a podcast. That's not sound, that's not smart. But hopefully you should be hearing the voices of other people on the next podcast. And there isn't really much else to add. You can always contact me at raccoonplusfriends@gmail.com. You can also follow me on my Twitter, which is Angry Raccoon. Only one C in the raccoon. I don't tweet anything on Twitter, but you can follow me if you want to. It's up to you. And everything I've talked about will be in the link and the download. I keep saying it in the download link and description. I don't know. I'm struggling with that. It's kind of like a weird tongue twister for me. But anyway, I'm rambling on. I'll end this podcast like I always do by saying I was the Angry Raccoon, and I will see you on the next podcast.